you, you can be me.
There aren't many artists in music history who could reinvent themselves the way David Bowie did. One album, he's a cosmic poet floating through the stars. The next, a shadowy prophet staring into the end of the world. Every era of his career felt like a completely new identity. But behind all those transformations, there was one constant: Bowie's endless curiosity about the artists who inspired him. And among those influences, one name stood out. Not because he was flashy or theatrical, but because he wasn't. That name was Neil Young, the quiet Canadian whose music carried the kind of emotional weight
Out of the blue and into the black.
that didn't need costumes or characters. Bowie once admitted that the first time he heard Neil Young's debut album back in 1969, he was dazzled. Those weren't just casual words. For an artist who had already begun crafting the strange, elegant worlds that would define his career, that moment left a mark, one strong enough to stay with him for decades. Out of all the artists Bowie admired, it was Neil Young's raw honesty that cut the deepest. Years later, long after Ziggy Stardust had fallen to earth,
Pushing through the market square, so many mothers sigh.
and the thin white Duke had faded into memory, Bowie finally paid tribute to the songwriter who had moved him so profoundly by reimagining one of Young's earliest songs. It wasn't a hit. It wasn't even a song most fans remembered. But for Bowie, it meant something. Because in I've Been Waiting for You, he heard something that mirrored his own soul: loneliness, yearning, and beauty suspended in air. But what was it about this simple Neil Young track that captivated one of music's greatest chameleons for over 30 years? And why did Bowie choose that moment, near the end of his career, to finally bring it to life? Let's unravel the story behind the Neil Young song David Bowie had always wanted to sing, and how it revealed one of the most intimate sides of his musical journey: the ever-elusive Bowie. Trying to define David Bowie was like trying to hold water in your hands. The moment you thought you understood him, he slipped into another form entirely. In the early 70s, he was Ziggy Stardust, the alien rock star who crash-landed on Earth to deliver a message of hope before burning out in his own fame. A few years later, he became the thin white Duke, cold, elegant, detached from humanity. By the time he released Black Star in 2016,
On the day of execution, only women kneel and smile.
he had transformed again, turning his own mortality into one final piece of art. Bowie didn't just change sounds, he changed worlds. Every era felt like stepping into a new universe, one where the rules of identity, style, and even gender were constantly rewritten. It's no wonder fans and critics alike struggled to pin down who exactly his influences were. Was he inspired by avant-garde theater, German expressionism, jazz, science fiction? The answer, of course, was yes, all of it. Bowie absorbed art like a sponge, turning every fascination into a fragment of his next creation. But here's what made him so different from everyone else. He didn't borrow from his influences, he transformed them. A song, a movie, a painting, anything could spark a whole new persona. Still, beneath all the glitter, makeup, and mystery, there was always something personal hiding in plain sight. Bowie's music wasn't just performance.
There's a starman waiting in the sky.
It was a reflection of his own search for meaning. And for an artist who lived in constant motion, the quiet sincerity of Neil Young's songwriting represented something Bowie rarely allowed himself to show: vulnerability. That's why, when he first heard Young's music in 1969, it hit him differently. Amid the chaos of glam rock, psychedelia, and cultural revolution, here was a voice that didn't need theatrics to make you feel something. And that raw, unfiltered honesty stuck with Bowie for the rest of his life. Because while the world saw Bowie as untouchable, the shape-shifting superstar, he saw something sacred in simplicity. But before that realization took hold, Bowie's mind was set on something else entirely: storytelling, theater, and the dream of bringing rock music to the stage in a way no one ever had.
Man waiting in the sky.
He'd like to come and meet us.
And that's where his next transformation began. The storyteller within. Before David Bowie became the chameleon of rock, he was a dreamer obsessed with storytelling. Long before Ziggy Stardust ever took the stage, Bowie imagined himself not as a pop star, but as a playwright. In his late teens, he was captivated by the world of musicals, the grand narratives, the shifting emotions, the way a song could carry an entire story. When I was around 17 or 18, Bowie once said, "What I wanted to do more than anything was write something for Broadway. I had no idea how you did it, but the idea of writing something rock-based for the stage really intrigued me." That dream never left him. Even when he traded the theater lights for the glare of a rock concert, Bowie never stopped writing like a dramatist. Every album became a stage play, hunky-dory.
And the good men tomorrow had their feet in the wallow and their heads.
Diamond Dogs, station to station.
As they pulled you out of the oxygen tent, you asked for the latest party.
Each one unfolding like a carefully constructed act in a never-ending show. But there was a catch. When your art becomes a performance, where does the real person go? Bowie's genius was in his ability to disappear into his creations. Yet the deeper he went into characters, aliens, dukes, prophets, the more he drifted away from the raw human emotion that first drew him to music. Behind the costumes and personas, there was a quiet longing for something simpler, something more real. That's what made Neil Young's music so magnetic to him. Young's songs didn't hide behind artifice. They lived and breathed honesty. Every line sounded like it came straight from the soul. To Bowie, that was the kind of truth you couldn't fake, and maybe the kind he missed amid all his own reinventions. He admired artists who could do both, who could build worlds but still hold on to heart. It's why his fascination with storytelling eventually led him back to simplicity. Because no matter how elaborate his art became, Bowie never forgot that every great story begins with a single, honest emotion. And when he finally heard Neil Young's debut album, that truth came crashing back. Theatrical ambition met pure sincerity, and Bowie was dazzled. Discovering Neil Young. It was 1969, the year man walked on the moon. Woodstock defined a generation, and the counterculture was in full bloom. David Bowie, still years away from superstardom, was searching for direction. His earlier singles had come and gone with little fanfare. He had the look, the imagination, and the ambition, but not yet the sound that felt truly his. Then came Neil Young. Bowie picked up Young's self-titled debut album almost by chance. It wasn't a commercial hit, and Neil himself was still finding his footing after leaving Buffalo Springfield. But the moment Bowie dropped the needle on that record, something clicked. Later, he described the experience in one simple, powerful word: dazzled. That wasn't a term Bowie used lightly. For him, it meant being overwhelmed not by flash or complexity, but by something deeper, a feeling. He said, "It was so majestic but aloft or lonely sounding at the same time. A real yearning." That line captures exactly what Bowie heard in Neil Young's music, beauty wrapped in melancholy. A sound that floated just above reach, like a dream you could never quite touch. One song in particular stood out, "I've Been Waiting for You." It was hauntingly simple.
I've been looking for a woman.
Built around a trembling vocal, a few aching chords, and a sense of longing that seemed endless. For Bowie, who was building elaborate musical universes and larger-than-life personas, this stripped-down honesty was mesmerizing. Neil Young didn't need costumes or characters. He didn't need to become anyone. He simply was. And that authenticity struck Bowie harder than any glam anthem or experimental jam ever could. It reminded him that music wasn't just about transformation. It was also about truth. From that moment, Neil Young became a quiet influence in Bowie's creative orbit, one he rarely talked about, but always felt. The connection wasn't about style or genre. It was about emotion. And though Bowie would go on to conquer the world with his alter egos, part of him never forgot that feeling he had in 1969, sitting in a room, listening to a lonely voice echo through the speakers, realizing that sometimes simplicity could be more powerful than spectacle. Years would pass, and Bowie would reinvent himself again and again. But that song, that sense of longing, never left him. And when the time finally came to reflect on his own journey, it was "I've been waiting for you," that called back to him like an echo from the past.
A woman with a feeling.
The hidden influence. For years, David Bowie's connection to Neil Young stayed hidden, buried beneath a lifetime of bold reinventions and new identities. He rarely mentioned Young in interviews, and fans almost never linked the two. After all, on the surface, they couldn't have been more different. Neil Young was all about raw truth, a man who walked on stage with just a guitar, a harmonica, and whatever emotion happened to be in his chest that night. Bowie, on the other hand, was the master of disguise, an artist who turned performance into mythology. But deep down, Bowie admired what Young represented. He once said that Neil's music felt majestic but lonely, a phrase that almost sounds like a mirror to Bowie's own life. Because for all his fame and flamboyance, Bowie often carried that same loneliness. His art gave him infinite masks to wear, but it also kept him at a distance from his own vulnerability. That's what fascinated him about Young. Neil didn't need to hide. He was never afraid to let the cracks show, in his voice, in his lyrics, in the way his songs sometimes felt like they could fall apart at any second. And that kind of courage, the courage to not be perfect, was something Bowie quietly envied. It's easy to forget that Bowie wasn't just a performer.
I caught you knocking at my cellar door.
He was a student of music. He studied other artists like a scientist examines light, breaking down what made their songs glow. With Neil Young, he found a rare kind of brilliance. Imperfection turned into art. You can hear echoes of that influence in some of Bowie's most emotional work. The quieter moments on Hunky Dory, the raw edges of Low, even the haunting restraint of Heathen. Beneath all the futuristic production and creative polish, there was always that Neil Young spirit, the search for honesty in a world of illusion. Still, Bowie never openly channeled that influence. It was too personal, too sacred. For decades, "I've Been Waiting for You" stayed just a song he loved, something he carried with him like a secret memory from his youth. But by the early 2000s, Bowie had changed. After years of exploring darkness, technology, and alienation, he began to look backward, reflecting on the artists and emotions that had shaped him. And in that moment of introspection, the song that once dazzled him returned, no longer as a memory, but as something he needed to finally make his own. Because after a lifetime of shape-shifting, Bowie was ready to stand still, if only for one song. The Heathen era and Bowie's return to reflection.
I was dead scared in my head that we'd try and recreate what we've been doing in the...
By the time David Bowie began working on Heathen in the early 2000s, the world, and Bowie himself, had changed. Gone were the days of outlandish costumes and glittering personas. The man who once turned every album into a new identity was now confronting something far more intimate: himself. Heathen wasn't just another record, it was a homecoming. After years spent exploring electronic soundscapes and avant-garde experiments, Bowie began looking backward, not out of nostalgia, but out of curiosity. He wanted to understand what had brought him here. It was a period of quiet reflection. He was approaching his mid-50s, raising a young daughter, and rethinking his relationship with fame, mortality, and legacy. The world after the turn of the millennium felt uncertain, and so did Bowie. That's why Heathen feels so haunting. It's not flashy or conceptual like Ziggy Stardust or Diamond Dogs. It's thoughtful, melancholic, and deeply human. The title itself, Heathen, suggests someone searching for faith, but not in a religious sense. It was Bowie searching for meaning in a world that no longer made sense. And during those sessions, he decided to make space for something special, tributes to the artists who had shaped him, not to mimic them, but to honor them. He said, "I do 3 covers on this album, in homage to the writers as much as any other reason." Among those covers was a song that had lived rent-free in his mind for over 3 decades, Neil Young's "I've Been Waiting for You." It wasn't the obvious choice. Bowie could have covered one of Young's classics, Heart of Gold or Old Man, but he didn't. He went back to the very beginning, to that first record, to that first spark that had dazzled him when he was still a young, hungry artist trying to find his sound. It's almost poetic. Bowie, the ultimate innovator, returning to a song from another artist's debut, a song that reminded him of when everything still felt possible. For him, Heathen wasn't about reinvention. It was about reconnection. And as he revisited Neil Young's words, "I've been waiting for you, and you've been coming to me," it felt as if Bowie wasn't just singing about love. He was singing to the version of himself he'd left behind. The restless dreamer who once sat listening to a Neil Young record in 1969, imagining what kind of artist he might become. And now, decades later, that dreamer finally had his answer. "I've Been Waiting for You" reimagined. When David Bowie finally recorded "I've Been Waiting for You" for Heathen, it wasn't just a cover, it was a time capsule. He wasn't trying to outshine Neil Young. He was communing with him, artist to artist, across decades of sound and experience. The original version of the song was fragile and yearning, Neil Young's voice quivering with uncertainty, backed by a trembling guitar line that felt like it might collapse under its own emotion. Bowie's version, though, was something entirely different. It opened with a pulsing rhythm, tight, almost mechanical, layered with ghostly guitars and a cold electronic sheen. Yet underneath that futuristic polish was the same aching soul that first drew him to the song. It sounded like space and solitude wrapped in melody, Bowie's eternal themes. His vocals were more deliberate, less pleading than Young's, but just as human. You could hear decades of experience in his voice, the weariness, the reflection, the quiet acceptance. Where Young's version sounded like a man waiting for love to arrive, Bowie's felt like a man who had already lived the story and was looking back on it. It's no accident that he recorded it during the Heathen era, a time when Bowie was meditating on faith, purpose, and the weight of his own legacy. The song became a mirror, reflecting everything he had been through: fame, isolation, reinvention, and rediscovery. Even the production itself carried meaning. Bowie worked closely with Tony Visconti, his longtime collaborator from the Hunky-Dory and Heroes days. Together, they reshaped the song into something both nostalgic and modern, a perfect metaphor for Bowie's career. And then, there was the sound of connection, a quiet cameo from Dave Grohl on guitar, whose raw, searing energy added another layer of emotion. Here was Bowie, bridging generations, the legendary innovator linking hands with one of rock's modern icons to reimagine a song that had once sparked his own imagination. It was elegant, it was eerie, it was emotional, and for those who listened closely, it revealed a side of Bowie that few had ever seen. The student behind the superstar, still in awe of the music that once inspired him to dream. He didn't cover the song for recognition. He covered it because it mattered. Because sometimes, when an artist carries a melody in their heart for 30 years, singing it out loud becomes the only way to set it free. The meaning behind the choice. For David Bowie, covering "I've Been Waiting for You" wasn't about nostalgia, it was about gratitude. After decades of pushing music to its limits, of turning art into theater and identity into myth, Bowie's choice to revisit a simple Neil Young song felt almost symbolic. It was him taking a breath. When he described the song, his words carried a quiet sincerity. "When I got that album in 1969, I was dazzled by the overall complexity of sound. It was so majestic but aloft or lonely sounding at the same time. A real yearning. And I'd always wanted to do that song on stage or someplace." That quote says everything. For Bowie, it wasn't just about melody or production, it was about feeling. That word, yearning, captures something Bowie had chased throughout his entire career. Every character he created, every sound he experimented with, was another way of trying to touch that emotion. The ache of wanting, the pull of becoming, the beauty of reaching for something just out of grasp. Neil Young's music embodied that effortlessly. He didn't need reinvention. His art came from stillness, from being present in the imperfection of the moment. And that's exactly what Bowie admired. The courage to be raw, to leave the edges rough, to let the song breathe. By covering "I've Been Waiting for You," Bowie wasn't just paying tribute to Neil Young. He was paying tribute to the idea of simplicity itself, something he'd spent a lifetime running from, and now finally embraced. It's a small moment in his vast career, but it reveals something profound about who he was beneath the personas. A student of music who never stopped learning, never stopped admiring, and never stopped searching. Because underneath the cosmic imagery and futuristic sounds, Bowie was still that young dreamer from 1969, sitting with a record player, listening to Neil Young, and feeling dazzled. And maybe, in his own way, this cover was Bowie's message back to the past. The circle completed. David Bowie spent a lifetime chasing reinvention. He built worlds, created characters, and transformed music itself. Yet in the midst of all that spectacle, he never lost sight of what first inspired him: the simple, unguarded honesty of an artist like Neil Young. Covering "I've Been Waiting for You" wasn't a gimmick. It wasn't a commercial choice. It was a quiet act of reverence, a private acknowledgement of the music that shaped him before the world ever knew his name. In that song, we see the student and the superstar coexisting, the young man dazzled by Young's debut, and the legendary innovator reflecting on a lifetime of art, finally letting a small but meaningful melody guide him home. It's a reminder that even the most transformative artists are shaped by those who came before them. Inspiration doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, quietly influencing, patiently waiting for the right moment to be recognized. And in Bowie's hands, that whisper became something unforgettable, a bridge across decades, a conversation between two souls, and a testament to the enduring power of honesty in music. Even as Bowie's personas changed, his genius lay in his ability to carry the heart of music with him. "I've Been Waiting for You" was more than a song cover. It was Bowie's acknowledgement that behind the ever-changing faces, behind the cosmic characters and theatrical reinventions, there was always a human being searching, yearning, and ultimately connecting with the music that mattered most. For fans, it's a lesson in listening to the artists we admire, to the emotions that inspire us, and to the moments that shape a lifetime of creativity. Because in the end, even the most dazzling chameleon of rock found his way back to a simple truth. Sometimes, the most profound journeys begin with a single song. And that circle, from awe to admiration to tribute, was finally complete.